hear me okay? All right, wonderful. What I want to talk to you today is a project that I'm working on that's called Ranking Digital Rights. And with Ranking Digital Rights, we are looking at how technology companies around the world are dealing with privacy and freedom of expression issues. And obviously, trust is an important factor in these issues. Before going into the exact index that we've put together, the research, etc., I want to step back a little bit and think about, why is this an issue? Why are we thinking about companies and trust, companies and human rights? The reason for that is that technology companies, on a daily basis, make decisions that affect how our rights are being treated. All right, so they make decisions, for example, about data collection. What do they collect? What do they not collect? They make decisions about how they respond to government requests. If a government comes asking them for user data, for example, what do? Do they just hand it over? Or do they have a sort of a process in place that provides some kind of safeguard against how the data might be treated? How do they deal with requests for content restriction is another thing. Do they train their employees on human rights issues? Are their employees sufficiently aware of the kind of risks that individual users of that company might have when their data is mistreated? And for example, another thing is, do they listen to complaints of their customers? So do they provide access to remedy? As an individual customer, do you have some sort of way of saying, well, I don't like what you did with my data, and I would like you to change this policy, or I'd like you to find some sort of redress for what the company's done. So we see companies making all these decisions. At the same time, we don't necessarily know how these decisions turn out, right? We know that they make these decisions, but we don't really know exactly how our rights are being respected. And I think this is where the trust issue comes in. As we learned in what Molly just explained about recent studies, as was also mentioned in the plenary opening this morning, there is an issue of distrust, meaning there are quite a few consumers who have a lack of trust in how businesses treat their data. At the same time, businesses obviously depend on that trust in order to thrive, in order to be marketable, etc. So how can we overcome this gap? How can we get all parties closer together? How can we make parties feel empowered as individuals? How can you feel that you are in control of your own data? And these are some of the things that we are trying to address with Ranking Digital Rights. So how do we do that? Our approach consists of two things. One is we're setting standards, meaning we're outlining in clear ways what we expect companies to do. We're trying to make very granular prescriptions for a company. If they want to show that they respect users' rights, they should do this, 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 and this. So there's the standard setting. And secondly, we then measure how companies are performing based on these standards, right? So there's first sort of the prescription, then secondly, okay, now that we know what they should be doing, how are they actually doing? The way we've put this together in a framework that everyone can access is in the framework of a corporate accountability index. We released our first corporate accountability index, the 2015 index, in November of last year. We're now working hard on the next one, which we'll actually release in the spring of next year. And in that index, we assess global technology companies. In the first index, we looked at 16 companies. We're going to expand to 22 in the next index. 8 internet companies, 8 telecommunications companies. We analyzed them across 3 different categories. Commitment, which basically means the kind of governance structure that a company has in place to deal with privacy and free expression issues. For example, do they have board-level oversight on these kind of things? Do they provide employee training, sort of things that I mentioned before? So that's commitment. Then we have freedom of expression, another very important category. And then privacy, which I'll focus this session a bit more on, is a third category that we focus on. And we use 31 indicators, each of them with many sub-elements, to analyze companies' performance. So this, you may well recognize, is the map of the world. And I'll slowly start filling in the companies that we analyze so you have some idea of where they're based. It's a globally focused project. Obviously, many of the major internet companies are based in the United States. We analyzed 5 of them: Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, Twitter, and Facebook. And then we also looked at Mail.ru in Russia, Tencent in China, and Kakao in South Korea. Then looking at the telecommunications companies, we looked at AT&T in the United States, América Móvil in Mexico, Vodafone in the UK, Orange in France, MTN in South Africa, Etisalat in the United Arab Emirates, Bharti Airtel in India, and Axiata in Malaysia. Now, these are not all just randomly picked companies. Each of these companies have enormous footprint, have a huge number of user base, generally above 100 million users in whatever capacity they operate, usually operations in multiple countries. So these are some of the biggest technology companies around the world and covering a great spread of individuals. So these are our main findings from the first index. One is there are no winners, meaning even the best performing company in our index scored 65 out of 100 possible points, which is not very encouraging. This means that overall, users are left in the dark. It's very difficult for an individual user to get some sense of how a company is treating their rights, how safe they should feel with the right to privacy or the right to freedom of expression with a particular company. At the same time, even though the overall headline is one that leads toward the negative side, there are some positive things to see. One is that there is a differentiation between companies. It's not that all companies are just flatly performing terrible. There is differentiation. We see some doing better on this, others doing better on that. And there's a pathway to improve. So our goal is not to say, hey, companies, you're doing bad, that company's doing terrible, etc. Our goal is obviously for companies to improve their practices and their policies. And we try to do so by giving very concrete recommendations of things that they could do to do better. And we believe that many of these things are actually quite easily achievable. Some things are more challenging, some things even require legislative change, but many of these things are well achievable. So to show you the overall results, these are the list of companies. On the top end, we have the internet companies. On the lower end, we have the telecommunications companies. As mentioned, among the internet companies, 65% is the highest score. It's for Google. With telecommunications companies, it's Vodafone that scores 54%. And we sort of made a distinction between companies that we feel they at least made some meaningful effort if they scored above 30%, even though the score is still rather poor. But they clearly make some efforts to do well in these things. And companies that are performing even below 30% of the possible points that they could get. And unfortunately, we see quite a few companies performing poorly. So to focus on the privacy category, Google, the top performing company in the privacy category, scores almost 60%. Again, not very high. Unfortunately, many other companies are scoring worse. Notably, the two EU-based companies, Vodafone and Orange, score below that. Orange scoring, if I recall, somewhere between 20 and 30%. With our expectation was that given the stronger data protection regulations in the EU, that these companies would perform better on these things, that they would more clearly communicate with the users how they deal with users' data. I want to highlight a few of the specific indicators that we look at to just give you some impression of what kind of questions we asked and what the answers were, what the scores were. So one question that we asked is, does the company disclose what user information it collects, how it collects this information, and why? This is sort of the headline question. We have many sub-elements for such a question. You can see them all on our website, rankingeachstrides.org. But to give you an impression of the performance, Kakao, the South Korean company, gets 80%, Facebook 67%, and from there it basically goes downhill. So we see a range of companies scoring in the 60s, 50s, 30s, 40s, and then in lower 20s. And this is basically the most basic question, right? If you want to know as an individual what kind of data the company has about you, this is a question you want to ask, right? What data are you collecting about me? So the scores are not very high, even though I must say they're higher than some other indicators. For example, if I go to the next indicator, sharing of user information, we know you collect it. Now, what do you do with it? Do you share it with advertisers? Do you share it with other parties? About that question, the top performing company, again, Kakao, scored 50% together with Yahoo, and all other companies scored below 50%. Google, as I mentioned, the top performing company in the category, scores even much below that. To give you some impression of how companies can disclose things differently. Just took a screenshot of some of the privacy policies of 2 different services. So WhatsApp, owned by Facebook, in their privacy policy, they say we do not sell or share your personally identifiable information with other third-party companies for their commercial or marketing use. We may share your personally identifiable information with third-party service providers to the extent that it's reasonably necessary to perform, improve, or maintain a WhatsApp service. And it gives you some impression of what they're after, but overall, we don't really know what parties they're dealing with, etc. This is different from Yahoo, which in its disclosure has a list where it says, okay, we share information with these kind of parties. So with analytics partners, we may share this kind of information. And this is the list of the specific companies that we may share that information with. So in that sense, it's much more concrete. And many companies are not very concrete about these sort of things, which also makes it more difficult for you to hold them accountable. Human rights impact assessment is another important one that we're looking at. With this question, we basically want to make sure that as companies are doing their business, as they're launching new products, as they're going into new markets, that they think through what kind of impact that may have on the human rights of their users, right? So do they consider, for example, the legislative environment that they might be in, the cooperation that would be forced on them with security services? Do they think when they develop a new kind of product, how that product might impact privacy rights? For that, we believe it's important that companies do these kind of impact assessments. Some companies are doing quite well. Yahoo scores nearly 90%. Other companies much below, notably Twitter, a company that generally presents itself at the forefront of human rights issues, does not disclose at all whether they make such an assessment as they are launching their products and services or as they are running their products and services. Grievance and remedy, another thing I pointed out in the earlier part of my talk. Do you as an individual have some sort of way to appeal a decision that a company has made, to complain about something that affects your privacy or free expression rights? Again, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record player, but the performance is not very good on this one either. So we see Bharti Airtel, the Indian telco, performing best, meaning they score 50%, but other companies are scoring much worse. So the bad news is there are no winners, right? So users generally don't know what happens with their information. With no company did we feel confident to say that as an individual user, is there any way for you to find out in a comprehensive format what the company is doing with your data? What do they collect, whom they share it with, how they use it? We don't know. And with all of us with a focus on data, that is a rather discouraging notice. The other thing is that disclosure about private requests in terms of service enforcement, this is partly related to freedom of expression, but also to privacy, is generally non-existent. We know that companies not only get requests from governments, but also from private parties for user information, but companies are very transparent about that. Another thing is that sometimes it's not only the companies doing, but also laws and regulations that make it more difficult for companies to be held accountable. So there are laws that say that some companies are not allowed to be transparent about the number of government requests they get if these requests pertain to national security issues and things like that. So sometimes, even if a company would want to do better and give more insight to individuals about how they treat you, they are not allowed to. Now, the good news is every company does something well, right? So there's no company that scored 0 overall. All companies do some things, as publishing privacy policies, explaining some things about how they deal with your data. Transparency reporting, where companies release on an annual basis or biannual basis information about generally government requests that they receive to restrict content or how they deal with a user data request, is increasingly common. More and more companies are doing this, and more companies are expanding this kind of disclosure. And the last thing on the good news part is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, right? So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of stuff that companies can actually be doing better on and quite easily. And we hope that by releasing this information, that we give them the instruments to do better. Okay. I'll just finish off with key recommendations for companies. So one is that companies should carry out risk assessments, or these are related to the human rights impact assessments that I mentioned before. They should be transparent and accountable, not only in government requests, but also in private requests in terms of service enforcement. They should communicate much clearer about what happens to user information, establish effective grievance and remedy mechanisms, and provide evidence of strong security practice. So these are key recommendations, and we believe that these kind of things that companies should be doing are really essential for individuals to be able to put their trust in a company and to use these company services effectively and have their rights respected at the same time. We're going to release the next index in 2017. As I mentioned, we're adding more companies, more company types. We're expanding our methodology. So stay tuned. We're going to publish the methodology and the list of companies in the coming weeks. Thanks very much.